Sometimes a man reaches a point in life where he believes his purpose has passed him by. For 63-year-old Clem Hartridge, that moment came on a cold evening in the Colorado mountains when he found 3 hungry children digging through garbage behind the general store. The oldest girl couldn't have been more than 10, trying to shield her 2 younger brothers from the bitter wind. Their clothes were torn and dirty, but their eyes still held hope. Clem had lived alone in his mountain cabin for 15 years, speaking to no one but the occasional trader. But something about these children stirred his heart in ways he'd forgotten were possible. He took them home that night, thinking he was just giving them a warm meal and a safe place to sleep. What he didn't know was that these 3 orphaned children were actually the missing heirs to a $6 million railroad fortune. When the lawyers finally tracked them down months later, Clem faced an impossible choice. Would he have to give up the family he never knew he wanted? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind that night carried the scent of snow down from the high peaks, and Clem Hartridge knew winter was coming early to the Colorado Territory. He pulled his wool coat tighter as he made his way through the narrow streets of Pine Ridge, the small mountain town that served as his only connection to civilization. At 63, Clem had grown accustomed to the solitude of his mountain cabin, 15 miles up a treacherous trail that most folks wouldn't dare attempt on horseback. Let alone on foot, he'd come to town for supplies, coffee, flour, and the few necessities that even a mountain hermit couldn't live without. The general store was closing when he arrived, the proprietor, Murphy, already sweeping the front steps in the fading light of early evening. "Evening, Clem," Murphy called out, his breath visible in the crisp air. "Cutting it close tonight." Clem nodded, a man of few words even in his most sociable moments. "Just need coffee and flour, if you got them." "Course I do." "Come on in before I lock up." As Murphy unlocked the door and lit the oil lamp, Clem's attention was drawn to sounds coming from the alley behind the store. Soft voices, barely audible above the wind, but unmistakably those of children. He frowned, knowing that no children lived in Pine Ridge proper. The handful of families had all moved down to the valley where the winters were less harsh. "You hear that?" Clem asked, pausing at the threshold. Murphy cocked his head, listening. "Oh, probably just cats fighting over scraps." "Come on, let's get you sorted before it gets full dark." But Clem knew the sound of children when he heard it. He'd been around enough of them during his younger years, before the war changed everything, before he'd lost his taste for human company and retreated to the mountains, where the only voices he heard were the wind through the pines and the distant call of eagles. After conducting his business with Murphy, Clem made his way around to the back of the store, following the narrow alley that led to the trash barrels, where Murphy disposed of the store's refuse. What he found there stopped him in his tracks. 3 children, huddled together near an overturned barrel, picking through the scraps with the careful desperation of those who knew real hunger. The oldest was a girl, maybe 10 years old, with tangled brown hair that might have been beautiful if it had seen soap and care. She was trying to shield 2 younger boys from the wind, her thin arms wrapped around them as they crouched in the shadows. Clem stood motionless for a moment, memories flooding back unbidden. He remembered being their age, remembered the gnawing emptiness in his belly, and the way hope could flicker like a candle flame in a strong wind. His own childhood had been marked by similar desperation, before a kind stranger had taken him in and given him a chance at life. The girl looked up suddenly, sensing his presence. Her eyes were large and dark, filled with a wariness that no child should possess. The boys pressed closer to her, and Clem could see the protective instinct that had already made her old, beyond her years. "Evening," Clem said softly, keeping his voice gentle and his hands visible. "You children all right?" The girl straightened slightly, lifting her chin with a dignity that spoke of better days. "We're fine, sir. Just looking for something we dropped." Clem recognized the lie for what it was, a shield against adult judgment and the kind of help that often came with strings attached. He'd told similar lies himself once upon a time. "That's so," he said, settling his weight against the alley wall to appear less threatening. "Well, it's getting mighty cold out here for looking. You got somewhere warm to spend the night?" The girl's composure faltered slightly, and she glanced at her brothers before answering. "Yes, sir. We're staying with our aunt," another lie delivered with the same careful dignity. Clem studied their faces in the dim light and saw the truth written there, as clearly as if it had been carved in stone. These children were alone in the world, with no aunt, no family, no one to care whether they lived or died. The war had taught Clem many things, most of them dark, but it had also taught him to recognize courage when he saw it. And this little girl, standing between her brothers and a world that had forgotten them, possessed more courage than most soldiers he'd known. "Tell you what," Clem said, reaching into his coat pocket. "I was just about to head home, and I've got more food than one old man can eat. You children look like you could use a hot meal and a warm place to sleep. No strings attached, no questions asked. Just one night, until you figure out your next move." The girl looked at him with those two old eyes, weighing his words against whatever experiences had taught her to be cautious. "One of the boys, maybe 8 years old, tugged at her sleeve." "Annie," he whispered, so quietly Clem almost missed it. "I'm cold, Annie, so that was her name." She looked down at the boy, then at the smaller one, who couldn't have been more than 6, and Clem saw the exact moment when her protective instincts won out over her caution. "You promise?" she asked, meeting Clem's eyes directly. "Just tonight, and then we can go?" "You have my word," Clem said, and meant it. The walk back to his cabin took nearly 3 hours, even with Clem carrying the smallest boy when his legs gave out. The trail was steep and rocky, winding through dense pine forests and across rushing mountain streams. Clem had made this journey countless times, but never with companions, and certainly never with children. Annie, he'd learned the boys were called Ben and Charlie, proved remarkably resilient. She kept pace with Clem's measured stride, encouraging her brothers when they stumbled and never once complaining about the cold or the distance. By the time they reached the cabin, Clem found himself genuinely impressed by her quiet strength. His cabin was modest but well built, constructed of sturdy pine logs and chinked against the mountain cold. A stone chimney rose from one end, and warm light spilled from the windows as Clem lit the oil lamps. It was a simple place, furnished with handmade furniture and the practical necessities of mountain life. But it was clean and warm and safe. The children stood uncertainly in the doorway, taking in their surroundings with the careful attention of those who'd learned to assess their environment quickly. Clem busied himself stoking the fire and putting coffee on to boil, giving them time to adjust. "You can set your things anywhere," he said, glancing at the small bundle Annie carried. "Outhouse is around back, and there's a basin and pitcher on the washstand if you want to clean up." It was then that he noticed what Annie was carrying so carefully, not belongings. Exactly, but a small torn photograph. Even from across the room, he could see it was a family portrait of some kind, though the details were lost to distance and damage. While the children took turns washing their faces and hands, Clem prepared a simple but hearty meal of beans, cornbread, and bacon. He'd lived alone so long that cooking for others felt strange, but also oddly satisfying. The cabin, which had seemed perfectly adequate for one man, suddenly felt alive with presence and purpose. As they sat around his small table, eating by lamplight, Clem studied his unexpected guests more closely. Despite their ragged clothing and obvious hardship, there was something refined about their manners, the way they sat straight-backed and used their utensils properly. Annie made sure her brothers ate before taking more than a few bites herself, and both boys said please and thank you without prompting. These weren't street children, Clem realized. They'd been raised with care and education, which made their current circumstances all the more puzzling. "This is real good, sir," Ben said, working his way through a second helping of beans. "Thank you kindly. Name's Clem," he replied. "And you're welcome. Charlie, the youngest, had barely spoken since they'd arrived, but he watched everything with bright, intelligent eyes. When he accidentally knocked over his cup of milk, he looked up at Clem, with such fear that it broke the old man's heart. "No harm done," Clem said gently, reaching for a cloth. "Happens to everybody." As the evening wore on, the children began to relax slightly. Ben asked polite questions about the cabin and the mountains, while Charlie gradually moved closer to the warmth of the fire. Annie remained watchful, but Clem could see exhaustion beginning to win out over caution. He made beds for them near the fireplace, using his spare blankets and pillows. As he tucked Charlie in, the little boy looked up at him with sleepy eyes. "Are you going to make us leave tomorrow?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The question hit Clem like a physical blow. He thought of his own childhood, of the nights spent wondering if tomorrow would bring kindness or cruelty, safety or abandonment. "We'll see," he said softly, smoothing the boy's hair. "For now, just sleep. You're safe here." As the children settled into sleep, Clem sat in his chair by the fire, watching their peaceful faces and thinking about the strange turn his life had taken. For 15 years, he'd chosen solitude, believing that his capacity for connection had died with his fellow soldiers in the war. He'd convinced himself that he was better off alone, that he had nothing to offer another human being. But sitting there in the firelight, listening to the soft breathing of 3 sleeping children, Clem felt something stirring in his chest that he'd thought was gone forever. It was hope, perhaps, or purpose, or maybe just the simple human need to matter to someone. Hidden in his dresser drawer, wrapped in an old piece of cloth, was a tarnished Civil War medal, recognition for valor in service to his country. He'd earned it the day he'd saved 6 men from a burning supply wagon, carrying them to safety one by one, while Confederate bullets whistled around his ears. The medal had once meant everything to him, proof that his life had value and meaning. But as he looked at the 3 children sleeping safely in his cabin, Clem realized that this moment, this simple act of providing shelter to those who needed it, felt more important than any medal or military commendation ever had. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and decisions. But tonight, for the first time in 15 years, Clem Hartridge didn't feel alone. 3 months had passed since that cold October night when Clem first brought the children home, and the mountain cabin had transformed into something he'd never expected, a real home filled with laughter, conversation, and the warm chaos of family life. Annie, Ben, and Charlie had settled into a routine that felt as natural as breathing, their initial wariness replaced by the easy confidence of children who knew they were wanted and safe. Annie had taken charge of many household duties with the quiet efficiency of someone twice her age, while Ben proved to have a natural talent for woodworking, spending hours at Clem's side learning to carve and whittle. Charlie, the youngest, had blossomed from a silent, fearful child into a bright chatterer who followed Clem around like a devoted shadow, asking endless questions about everything from why snow fell to how eagles learned to fly. The transformation wasn't just in the children. Clem found himself looking forward to each day in ways he hadn't experienced since before the war. The cabin that had once felt like a refuge from the world now felt like the center of his universe, filled with purpose and meaning he'd forgotten were possible. It was on a crisp January morning, when Clem made his monthly trip to Pine Ridge for supplies, that the first warning signs appeared. Murphy was arranging inventory when Clem entered the general store, but instead of his usual friendly greeting, the shopkeeper looked troubled, glancing around nervously before speaking. "Morning, Clem," Murphy said, keeping his voice low. "Glad you came in today. Been meaning to tell you. Had a stranger in here yesterday asking questions." Clem felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "What kind of questions?" "About children. 3 of them specifically. Said he was a lawyer from Denver, looking for some missing youngsters. Had official papers and everything." Murphy paused, studying Clem's face. "Name was Preston Mills. Well-dressed fellow, polite enough, but something about him didn't sit right with me." The careful peace that had settled over Clem's life these past months suddenly felt fragile as glass. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing much. Said I hadn't seen any children matching his description. Murphy's weathered face creased with concern. But Clem, if those young ones you've been caring for are in some kind of trouble— They're not in trouble, Clem interrupted, perhaps more sharply than he intended. They're good children. The best, Murphy nodded quickly. Didn't mean to suggest otherwise. It's just, this Mills fellow seemed mighty determined. Said he'd be staying at the boarding house for a few days, asking around. Clem completed his business with Murphy as quickly as possible, his mind racing with possibilities, none of them good. As he loaded his supplies onto his pack horse, he noticed a well-dressed man in a fine wool coat emerging from the boarding house across the street. Even from a distance, Clem could tell this wasn't a typical Pine Ridge visitor. His clothes were too expensive, his bearing too refined for someone who belonged in a rough mountain town. Their eyes met briefly across the muddy street, and Clem felt the man's sharp, calculating gaze take in every detail of his appearance. He forced himself to move at his normal, unhurried pace as he led his horse toward the trail home. But every instinct honed by years of military service was screaming that he was being watched, evaluated and potentially followed. The ride back to the cabin felt endless. Clem found himself checking over his shoulder repeatedly, though he saw no signs of pursuit. By the time he reached home, his mind had conjured dozens of scenarios, each worse than the last. The children greeted him with their usual enthusiasm, Annie helping to unload supplies, while Ben and Charlie peppered him with questions about his trip to town. For a moment, watching their animated faces in the warm lamplight, Clem almost convinced himself that Murphy's warning was nothing more than a coincidence, a misunderstanding that would resolve itself without touching their peaceful world. But that evening, as he helped Charlie with his letters and listened to Ben practice reading aloud, Clem noticed something that made his blood run cold. Annie was sitting by the fire, holding that same torn photograph she'd carried the night he found them. But now, in the better light of the cabin, he could make out more details. It was indeed a family portrait, but not of poor folks. The man and woman in the photograph were dressed in fine clothing, standing in front of what appeared to be an elegant home. And the three children in the picture, despite the photograph's damage, were unmistakably Annie, Ben, and Charlie, though younger and dressed in the kind of expensive clothes that spoke of wealth and privilege. "Annie," Clem said gently, "can I see that picture?" She looked up, startled, as if she'd forgotten she was holding it. For a moment her old wariness flickered in her eyes, but then she handed it over without protest. Studying the photograph more closely, Clem could see what he'd missed before. This wasn't just any well-to-do family. The setting, the clothes, the photographer's formal style all suggested serious money. Railroad money, mining money, the kind of wealth that built empires in the Colorado Territory. "Annie," he said carefully, "who are these people in the picture?" "Our parents," she said simply, as if it should be obvious. "And what happened to them?" Annie's face closed down, the way it used to in those first days when she'd been afraid to trust him. "They died," she said, "in an accident," but something in her voice, a slight tremor that spoke of deeper fears than simple grief, told Clem there was more to the story than she was willing to share. Over the next 2 days, Clem found himself studying the children with new eyes, looking for clues he'd missed. Their refined manners, their obvious education, the way they spoke, it all pointed to a background of privilege and wealth. How had children from such circumstances ended up digging through garbage in a mountain town? His questions were answered sooner than he'd hoped when he discovered a folded piece of paper tucked inside Annie's small bundle of possessions. It was water-damaged and partially illegible, but enough remained for him to make out key phrases: Colorado Central Railroad, inheritance, estate of, and most troubling of all, missing heirs. The paper appeared to be part of some kind of legal document, possibly related to a trust fund or inheritance. Clem's hands shook slightly as he read what he could make out, realizing that his worst fears were likely true. These weren't just any orphaned children. They were the missing heirs that Lawyer was looking for. That night, after the children were asleep, Clem sat by the dying fire and tried to make sense of what he'd learned. If Annie, Ben, and Charlie were indeed heirs to some kind of fortune, why had they been living on the streets? Who were they running from, and why? The next morning brought his answer in the form of hoofbeats on the trail leading to his cabin. Clem looked out his window to see two men on horseback approaching. One was the well-dressed stranger he'd seen in town. The other, a rough-looking character who had the bearing of hired muscle. "Children," Clem said quietly, "I need you to go to the back room and stay there until I tell you it's safe to come out." Annie looked at him with those two wise eyes and seemed to understand immediately. "Is it them?" she whispered. "The people looking for us?" "Maybe," Clem said. "But I won't let anyone take you somewhere you don't want to go. That's a promise." As the children disappeared into the back room, Clem checked his rifle and positioned himself by the front window. The men had stopped about 50 yards from the cabin, close enough to talk, but far enough to avoid immediate confrontation. "Mr. Hartridge," the well-dressed man called out. "My name is Preston Mills. I represent certain legal interests in Denver, and I believe you may have information that could help me locate 3 missing children." Clem stepped onto his porch, rifle held casually but visibly. "Don't know anything about missing children." Mills smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Perhaps I should be more specific. 3 children, Annie, Benjamin, and Charles Ashford. They've been missing for several months now, and there are people very concerned about their welfare." The name hit Clem like a physical blow. Ashford. He'd heard that name before, in connection with railroad money and mining interests. If these children were Ashfords, they weren't just heirs to a fortune. They were heirs to one of the largest fortunes in the Colorado Territory. "Like I said," Clem replied evenly. "Don't know anything about that." Mills studied him for a long moment, then reached into his coat and pulled out an official-looking document. "I have legal authority to search these premises for the missing children, and I should mention there's a substantial reward for information leading to their safe return. And I should mention," Clem said, raising his rifle slightly, "that this is private property, and you're not welcome here." The tension stretched between them like a taut wire. Finally, Mills folded the document and put it away. "This isn't over, Mr. Hartridge. Those children belong with their family, not with some hermit in the mountains. We'll be back." As the 2 men rode away, Clem remained on his porch until they disappeared down the trail. Only then did he allow himself to fully comprehend what had just happened. The peaceful life he'd built with Annie, Ben, and Charlie was about to be torn apart, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do to stop it, unless, of course, he was willing to fight for it. After Mills and his companion disappeared down the mountain trail, Clem called the children from the back room. Annie emerged first, her face pale but determined, followed by Ben and Charlie, who clung to their sister's hands with obvious fear. "Who were those men, Pa?" Charlie asked, using the name that had naturally evolved over the past months, a name that never failed to warm Clem's heart. Even in moments like this, Clem knelt down to Charlie's level, choosing his words carefully. "Men who think they know what's best for you children. But they don't know you like I do." Annie stepped forward, her jaw set with familiar resolve. "They're going to try to take us away, aren't they?" The direct question deserved an honest answer. "They might try," Clem admitted. "But I won't let that happen without a fight." Over the next few days, Clem found himself caught between 2 equally strong impulses: the desire to protect the children he'd come to love as his own, and the growing realization that he might be keeping them from something that was rightfully theirs. The torn photograph and the legal document he'd found told a story of wealth and privilege that was far removed from their simple mountain life, but watching the children go about their daily routines, Annie helping with breakfast, Ben practicing his woodworking, Charlie reading aloud from one of Clem's few books. He couldn't imagine that any amount of money could give them more than what they already had. They were happy here, safe and loved and free to be children instead of heirs to a fortune that seemed to bring more danger than blessing. The answer to some of his questions came during his next trip to Pine Ridge. 2 weeks after Mills's visit, Murphy was waiting for him with news and a warning. "That lawyer fellow's been back," Murphy said, glancing around the store as if Mills might be listening from the shadows. "Asked more questions, offered money for information. But Clem, I found out something you need to know." Murphy reached under his counter and pulled out a newspaper from Denver, folded to show a particular article. The headline made Clem's blood run cold. "Search continues for missing railroad heirs." According to this, Murphy continued, "those children's parents died in a train accident 6 months ago. Left behind one of the biggest railroad fortunes in the territory. The children disappeared from their guardian's home in Denver, and there's been a massive search ever since." Clem scanned the article, his worst fears confirmed. Annie, Ben, and Charlie weren't just wealthy, they were among the richest children in Colorado. The article mentioned a trust fund worth over $6 million, managed by their uncle until they came of age. "There's something else," Murphy said, lowering his voice. "I did some asking around discreet-like. That Mills fellow, he's not the only one looking for those children. Word is, there's family fighting over who gets to be their guardian, and where there's that much money involved. People get desperate," Clem finished grimly. "Exactly. Now, I don't know what those young ones told you about how they ended up on their own, but if they ran away from their guardian, they might have had good reason." On the ride home, Clem's mind churned with new understanding. The children hadn't just lost their parents. They'd fled from someone who was supposed to protect them. The question was why, and whether returning them to their family would truly be in their best interests. He found his answer that evening when he decided to have an honest conversation with Annie. After Ben and Charlie were asleep, he sat beside her by the fire and showed her the newspaper article. Annie read it slowly, her face growing paler with each line. When she finished, she looked up at Clem with eyes that held too much knowledge for a 10-year-old. "You know now," she said simply. "I know you're richer than most folks can imagine," Clem replied. "What I don't know is why 3 wealthy children were digging through garbage in Pine Ridge." Annie was quiet for so long that Clem began to think she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "After our parents died, we went to live with Uncle Theodore in Denver. At first, he seemed nice enough, but then," she paused, swallowing hard, "he said we were too much trouble, that we needed to learn our place. He hired a woman, Miss Crawford, to take care of us, but she was mean. Really mean." Clem felt anger building in his chest, but he kept his voice gentle. "Mean how?" "She would lock us in our rooms for hours if we made any noise. She said children should be seen and not heard, especially children who were costing so much money to feed and clothe. And Uncle Theodore, he started talking about sending us to different schools, splitting us up. He said it would be better for our education, but I think he just didn't want to deal with us." The picture Annie painted was becoming clearer, and it filled Clem with a cold rage. These children hadn't just lost their parents. They'd been treated as burdens by the very people who should have protected them. "So you ran away," he said. Annie nodded. "We saved up a little money from our allowances, and one night, when Miss Crawford was drunk and Uncle Theodore was traveling, we just left. We thought we could make it to our cousin in California, but our money ran out in Pine Ridge, and you've been hiding ever since. We were so scared someone would recognize us and send us back. That's why—" She hesitated, then reached into her bundle and pulled out a small, elegant business card. "I found this the day before those men came to the cabin. Someone dropped it in town." Clem took the card, recognizing it immediately. Preston Mills, attorney at law, with an address in Denver and the seal of a prestigious legal firm embossed in gold. "Annie," he said carefully, "what if I told you that not everyone looking for you wants to hurt you? What if there are people who genuinely want to help?" She looked at him with those wise, wounded eyes. "How can we tell the difference?" It was a fair question, and one that Clem didn't have a good answer for. But he was beginning to understand that this situation was more complicated than a simple choice between keeping the children and giving them up. The next morning brought confirmation that they were running out of time. Clem woke to find fresh hoof prints around the cabin. Someone had been watching them during the night. The prints led down the mountain toward town, but their message was clear. They were being monitored, possibly hunted. At breakfast, He made a decision that went against every protective instinct he possessed. "Children," he said, "we need to talk about your future." Annie set down her coffee cup, her face already closing off in preparation for bad news. Ben and Charlie looked between their sister and Clem, sensing the gravity of the moment. "I've been thinking about what's best for you," Clem continued, "and I'm starting to believe that hiding up here might not be the answer." "You want to send us back," Annie said flatly. "I want to make sure you're safe and happy," Clem corrected. "And that might mean finding out who we can trust in that world you came from. Your parents left you that money for a reason, to give you choices and opportunities. Maybe it's time we figured out how to claim those things without losing what we've built here." It was a compromise, born of love and desperation. But as Clem looked at the three faces around his table, he realized that sometimes the hardest part of protecting someone was knowing when to stop running and start fighting back. The question was whether they would have the chance to make that choice, or whether the decision would be made for them. The decision to move deeper into the mountains came after Clem discovered more hoofprints around the cabin for 3 consecutive mornings. Someone was conducting regular surveillance, and it was only a matter of time before they made their move. "We're going on an adventure," Clem told the children as he packed essential supplies into his old military rucksack. "Remember that hunting cabin I told you about up near Eagle's Rest? Time you young ones learned some proper mountain skills." Annie studied his face with her usual perceptiveness. "This isn't really about mountain skills, is it?" "No," Clem admitted. "It's about keeping you safe while we figure out our next move." The old hunting cabin was a 2-day hike through some of the most rugged terrain in the Colorado Rockies. Clem had built it years ago as a winter shelter during extended hunting trips, and few people even knew of its existence. If they needed time to think and plan, it would provide the isolation they required. The journey tested all of them. Ben proved surprisingly resilient, matching Clem's pace with determination that reminded the old soldier of his younger self. Charlie struggled more with the altitude and steep terrain, but never complained, accepting Clem's help with the quiet dignity that had marked all 3 children from the beginning. Annie moved through the mountains with a natural grace that surprised Clem. Despite her privileged upbringing, she adapted to the physical demands of mountain travel with remarkable ease, helping her brothers when they stumbled and keeping everyone's spirits up with quiet encouragement. On the second evening, as they made camp beside a rushing mountain stream, Clem began teaching them skills he'd learned during his military service: how to read the weather from cloud formations, how to find north without a compass, how to move quietly through dense forest. He framed it as adventure and education, but underneath was the grim knowledge that these children might need to survive on their own if something happened to him. "Why do you know so much about this stuff?" Ben asked as Clem showed him how to set snares for rabbits. "The war taught me a lot of things," Clem replied. "Some good, some bad. These are the good things." That night, as the children slept around the small campfire, Clem found himself thinking about his own father, a man who died when Clem was barely older than Ben. His father had been a good man, but unprepared for the harshness of frontier life. Clem had sworn then that if he ever had children of his own, he'd make sure they could take care of themselves no matter what life threw at them. It was a promise he'd never expected to have the chance to keep. The hunting cabin was exactly as he'd left it, small but sturdy, built into the side of a granite outcropping that provided natural protection from wind and weather. It had a stone fireplace, 2 small rooms, and enough space for 4 people to live comfortably if they didn't mind close quarters. "It's perfect," Annie said, setting down her pack and looking around with genuine appreciation. "It feels safe." That first evening in the cabin, as Clem prepared a simple meal of beans and cornbread, Annie approached him with something she'd been carrying in her coat pocket. It was a small gold locket, tarnished with age but obviously valuable. "I want you to see this," she said, opening it carefully to reveal 2 tiny portraits, a man and woman who bore strong resemblances to the children. "Your parents," Clem said softly. "Their names were Jonathan and Elizabeth Ashford," Annie said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. Papa built the Colorado Central Railroad from nothing. Mama came from back east, from a family that owned textile mills. Clem studied the portraits, seeing Annie's determined chin in her mother's face and Ben's gentle eyes in his father's. They looked like good people. They were. Annie's voice grew stronger. Papa always said that money was meant to help people, not just make more money. He built schools and hospitals along the railroad routes. Mama started programs to help immigrant families get settled in Colorado. And your uncle? Annie's expression darkened. Uncle Theodore isn't like that. He thinks money is for buying things and making people do what you want. After Papa and Mama died, he kept talking about maximizing our assets and strategic investments. He wanted to sell Papa's schools to mining companies. The picture was becoming clearer, and it filled Clem with a deep anger. These children weren't just heirs to wealth. They were heirs to a legacy of generosity and social responsibility that their uncle seemed determined to destroy. Annie, Clem said carefully, what exactly happened the night you ran away? She was quiet for a long moment, absently polishing the locket with her sleeve. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Uncle Theodore had been drinking. He'd been doing that a lot since we came to live with him. Miss Crawford was there too, and they were talking about us like we weren't even in the room. Uncle Theodore said we were costing too much money, that it would be easier if we just disappeared until we turned 18 and could sign the inheritance over to him. Clem felt his hands clench into fists. He said that in front of you? He didn't know we were listening. But Ben started crying, and Uncle Theodore got angry. He said if we couldn't be quiet, maybe we needed to learn some discipline. That's when Miss Crawford suggested the boarding schools, different ones in different states. She said it would teach us proper behavior and keep us out of Uncle Theodore's hair. So you decided to leave? Annie nodded. We heard them making plans to split us up the next week. I couldn't let that happen. Ben and Charlie are all I have left of our real family. As Clem listened to Annie's story, he realized that the children's flight from Denver hadn't been a childish impulse. It had been a desperate act of survival. They'd chosen poverty and uncertainty over the slow destruction of everything their parents had taught them to value. You did the right thing, he told her. Whatever else happens, you protected your brothers when no one else would. That night, after the children were asleep, Clem sat by the dying fire and made some hard decisions. He couldn't keep running indefinitely. Eventually, the children would be found, and when that happened, he wanted to be ready with more than just good intentions. He needed allies, information, and most importantly, he needed to understand exactly who they were fighting and why. The children's inheritance was more than just money. It was power, and in the wrong hands. That power could be used to destroy everything Jonathan and Elizabeth Ashford had built. But first, he had to make sure Annie, Ben, and Charlie understood the choice they were facing. They could keep running, living as fugitives from their own lives, or they could stand and fight for their right to honor their parents' legacy. Either way, Clem was determined to stand with them. These children had given him back his sense of purpose, and he'd be damned if he let anyone take that away, from them or from him. The morning Clem decided to tell the children the full truth about their situation dawned clear and cold, with fresh snow dusting the peaks around their hidden cabin. He'd spent most of the night awake, wrestling with the weight of what he'd learned and what it meant for their future together. After breakfast, as the children sat around the small table they'd fashioned from pine logs, Clem placed the newspaper article Murphy had given him in the center, alongside Annie's locket and the business card she'd found. "Children," he began, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his heart. "It's time we talked honestly about who you are and what that means." Annie reached instinctively for her brother's hands, a gesture that had become automatic whenever adults wanted to discuss their future. Ben and Charlie moved closer to their sister, forming the protective circle that had sustained them through months of uncertainty. "We know we're rich," Ben said quietly. "Annie told us about the money our parents left." "It's more than just money," Clem said gently. "According to this article, your parents built something important. Schools, hospitals, programs to help people build better lives. They use their wealth to make the world a little better. Charlie, who'd been listening with the intense concentration he brought to everything, looked up at Clem with bright eyes. Like how you helped us. The simple question hit Clem harder than he'd expected. Yes, he said, like that. Annie studied the newspaper article again, her jaw tightening as she read. It says Uncle Theodore is managing our trust fund until we're 18. That means he controls everything Papa and Mama built. For now, Clem agreed. But that doesn't mean it has to stay that way. It was then that Annie surprised him by reaching into her coat and pulling out another piece of paper, one Clem had never seen before. It was water-damaged and partially torn, but clearly an official document. I've been carrying this since we left Denver, she said, unfolding it carefully. I took it from Uncle Theodore's desk the night we ran away. Clem examined the document, his military training in reading official papers serving him well despite the damage. What he could make out made his blood run cold. It appeared to be part of a trust fund modification, with language about restructuring assets and consolidated management. Most disturbing were the phrases he could partially read. In the event of the heir's absence and permanent guardianship transfer. Annie, he said slowly, do you understand what this means? She nodded, her face pale but determined. It means Uncle Theodore was planning to have us declared missing permanently. If we'd stayed much longer, he would have found a way to take control of everything Papa and Mama left us. The implications hit Clem like a physical blow. The children hadn't just fled mistreatment. They'd escaped what amounted to a legal kidnapping designed to steal their inheritance and destroy their parents' legacy. That's why we can never go back, Ben said, his young voice carrying a weight no 8-year-old should bear. He'll find a way to get rid of us for good. Clem looked at the three faces around the table, Annie's fierce protectiveness, Ben's quiet wisdom, Charlie's trusting innocence, and felt something shift inside him. These weren't just children he'd grown to love. They were refugees from a war they hadn't started, and they deserved someone who would fight for them with everything he had. What if I told you there might be another way? He said, Annie's eyes sharpened with interest. What do you mean? And that lawyer Mills, what if he's not working for your uncle? What if there are people looking for you who actually want to help? How do we know the difference? Annie asked, echoing her question from weeks earlier. We don't, Clem admitted. But we can't keep running forever. Eventually, you'll need to claim what's rightfully yours. Not just the money, but the chance to continue what your parents started. It was Charlie who asked the question that cut to the heart of everything. Will we still be a family? Clem felt his throat tighten with emotion. Over the past months, these children had become more precious to him than his own life. The thought of losing them was almost unbearable, but the thought of failing to protect their future was worse. That depends, he said carefully, on what you want. Annie straightened in her chair, and for a moment, Clem could see the woman she would become, strong, determined, and absolutely uncompromising when it came to protecting the people she loved. I want us to stay together, she said firmly. All of us, Ben and Charlie and you. I don't care about the money if it means losing our family. But Annie, Ben said quietly, what about all the people Papa and Mama were helping? What happens to them if Uncle Theodore gets control? It was a question that revealed the depth of these children's character. Despite everything they'd been through, they were still thinking about others, still carrying the responsibility their parents had taught them to feel for those less fortunate. That's exactly why we need to be smart about this, Clem said. Running away saved you from your uncle, but it can't save your parents' legacy. For that, we need to fight back. That afternoon, Clem began teaching the children lessons he'd hoped they'd never need. How to recognize when they were being followed. How to send coded messages. How to identify people who might be trusted versus those who posed threats. He framed it as games and puzzles, but the underlying message was serious. They were no longer just hiding from their problems. They were preparing to face them. As evening approached, Clem found himself thinking about his old commanding officer, a man who'd taught him that sometimes the best defense was a carefully planned offense. They couldn't stay hidden forever. but they could choose the time and place for their confrontation with the forces trying to control the children's lives. "Pa," Annie said as he tucked her in that night, "are you scared?" "Terrified," he admitted, "but not of fighting for you. I'm scared of letting you down." Annie reached up and touched his weathered cheek with her small hand. "You couldn't let us down. You saved us. You saved me first," he replied, and meant it with every fiber of his being. That night, as snow began to fall outside their small cabin, Clem made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow he would begin the journey back towards civilization, not to surrender, but to find allies and gather the information they needed to take back what belonged to these children. It was time to stop running and start fighting for the family they'd chosen to become. The journey down from Eagle's Rest took 3 days, with Clem deliberately choosing routes that would keep them hidden while gradually working their way back towards civilization. He'd made the decision to trust Preston Mills, but that didn't mean he was ready to walk blindly into what might be a trap. On the second night, camped in a grove of aspens, whose golden leaves rustled like whispered secrets in the mountain wind, Clem began writing in the leather-bound journal he'd kept sporadically since the war. But these entries were different from his usual brief notes about weather and supplies. These pages were filled with sketches of the children and careful observations about their growth, their fears, their remarkable resilience. Annie discovered him writing by firelight and asked what he was documenting. "Evidence," Clem said simply. "If something happens to me, I want there to be a record of who you really are. Not just the heirs to a fortune, but the children who've become the center of my world." She settled beside him, watching as he sketched Charlie's face, capturing the way the boy's eyes lit up when he laughed. "You think like a soldier," she observed. "Old habits," Clem admitted. "In the war, we learned to document everything important because you never knew who might need that information later." "Tell me about the war," Annie said, a request that surprised him. In all their months together, she'd never asked about his past. Clem closed the journal and stared into the fire, choosing his words carefully. It was a time when good people had to do hard things to protect what mattered most. "A lot like now, I suppose. Were you scared?" "Every day. But I learned that being scared doesn't make you weak, it makes you careful. And being careful keeps the people you love safe." The next morning brought an unexpected encounter that changed everything. As they approached the outskirts of Pine Ridge, Clem spotted a lone rider ahead on the trail. His first instinct was to take cover, but something about the rider's posture and the way he sat his horse seemed familiar. It was Murphy, riding a horse Clem had never seen him use, clearly on a deliberate mission rather than a casual journey. "Clem," Murphy called when he spotted them. "Thank God I found you. We need to talk and we don't have much time." Murphy's news was both encouraging and terrifying. Mills had indeed returned to Pine Ridge, but he wasn't alone. He'd brought with him a woman Murphy described as a real lady, spoke with authority, along with 2 men who appeared to be federal marshals. "But here's the thing," Murphy continued, glancing nervously at the children. "They've got Theodore Ashford with them, and that man's been throwing money around like confetti, trying to get folks to say they never saw any children with you." Clem felt cold dread settle in his stomach. "How many people has he convinced?" "Not as many as he'd hoped," Murphy said with grim satisfaction. "Turns out folks in Pine Ridge don't much like being told what to say, especially by some fancy man from Denver who thinks his money makes him better than mountain folk." Annie stepped forward, her young face set with determination. "Is Uncle Theodore still in town?" Murphy nodded. "At the boarding house, acting like he owns the place." "Good," Annie said, surprising both men with her vehemence. "It's time he answered for what he's done." That evening, camped just outside town, Clem convened what he thought of as a war council. The children sat around their small fire while he outlined what they knew and what they needed to accomplish. "Mills might be legitimate," he said, "but your uncle's presence complicates everything. If Theodore's managed to convince the authorities that he's the rightful guardian, they might not listen to your side of the story. Then we need proof. Ben said, with the practical wisdom that continued to amaze Clem. Something that shows what Uncle Theodore really is. Annie reached into her pack and pulled out the damaged trust fund document. This is evidence, but it's not enough by itself. We need someone official to understand what it means. It was Charlie who made the observation that proved most insightful. Uncle Theodore doesn't know we have that paper. Maybe we can use it to make him tell the truth. Clem studied the youngest boy with new respect. What do you mean? If he thinks no one knows about his plans, maybe he'll say things he shouldn't say. Like when grown-ups talk in front of children because they think we don't understand. The plan that emerged from their discussion was simple but risky. They would approach Mills directly, but in a public setting where Theodore couldn't control the narrative. The general store, with Murphy as a witness, would provide the neutral ground they needed. If Mills is really trying to help us, Annie reasoned, he'll listen to our story. If he's working with Uncle Theodore, we'll know soon enough. The next morning, Clem sent Murphy into town with a carefully worded message for Mills. The people you're looking for are ready to talk, but only if all interested parties are present. He specified the time and place, noon at the general store, and added a crucial detail. The children would be accompanied by their chosen guardian, who had legal documents that might be relevant to the case. As they prepared for what might be their final morning together as a hidden family, Clem found himself studying each child's face, memorizing details he prayed he wouldn't lose. Annie's fierce protectiveness as she helped Charlie with his boots. Ben's gentle humor as he teased his sister about her serious expression. Charlie's absolute trust as he slipped his small hand into Clem's weathered one. Whatever happened at that meeting, whatever legal complications emerged from revealing their location, these months in the mountains had been the most meaningful of Clem's life. He'd found his family in the most unexpected way, and he was determined to fight for them with everything he had. "Pa," Annie said as they prepared to leave their camp, "what if they don't let us stay together?" Clem knelt down so he could look all three children in the eyes. "Then we'll find another way. Family isn't just about living in the same house. It's about people who choose to love each other, no matter what. Nothing that happens today can change the fact that you're my children and I'm your father. Not because of laws or papers, but because we chose each other. It was a promise he intended to keep, regardless of what Theodore Ashford, Preston Mills, or anyone else had to say about it." As they walked down the mountain trail toward Pine Ridge, Clem felt the weight of his journal in his pack, a record of love and growth that no legal document could match, and proof that some families are forged not by blood or law, but by the simple human need to protect and cherish those who matter most. The general store felt smaller with so many people crowded inside. Clem arrived first with the children, positioning themselves near the back where they could observe everyone who entered. Murphy stood behind his counter, nervous, but determined to see justice done. The federal marshals came next, two serious men who nodded respectfully to Clem and took positions near the door. Preston Mills entered precisely at noon, followed by a distinguished woman in her 50s, whom he introduced as Judge Martha Crawford from the Denver District Court. Clem noted with approval that she studied the children with genuine concern rather than the calculating assessment he'd expected from someone. Working with Theodore Ashford was the last to arrive, and his presence filled the room with tension thick as smoke. He was a large man, well-dressed and commanding, but there was something in his eyes that Clem recognized from the war, the look of someone who'd convinced himself that ruthless actions were justified by their results. "Well," Theodore said, his voice carrying the authority of wealth and position, "I see our little runaways have finally been found." Annie stepped slightly behind Clem, but her voice was clear and steady when she spoke. "Hello, Uncle Theodore." "Annie, my dear." Theodore's tone was practiced sympathy tinged with reproach. "You've caused everyone such worry, but thank goodness you're safe. We'll have you back home where you belong in no time." It was Mills who spoke next, his voice carefully neutral. "Before we discuss anyone's return, I think it would be beneficial to hear from all parties involved. Mr. Hartridge, I understand you've been caring for these children. I have, Clem said simply. And they've been cared for well. I'm sure they have, Judge Crawford interjected. But the question of legal guardianship is quite clear, Theodore interrupted. I am their appointed guardian, as specified in my brother's will. These children belong with their family, not with some stranger in the mountains. Annie's hand found Clem's, and he felt her trembling slightly. But when she spoke, her voice was stronger than he'd ever heard it. Judge Crawford, she said, may I tell you what really happened the night we left Denver? Theodore's face darkened. Annie, dear, you're just a child. You don't understand the complexities of adult decisions. I understand enough, Annie replied, then looked directly at the judge. I understand that Uncle Theodore was planning to send us to different boarding schools so he could control our inheritance without having to deal with us. That's preposterous, Theodore blustered. Those schools would have provided you with excellent educations. In different states, Ben added quietly. So we'd never see each other again. Judge Crawford's expression grew more serious. Is this true, Mr. Ashford? Educational decisions were made in the children's best interests, Theodore said stiffly. Sometimes difficult choices must be made for the greater good. It was then that Annie reached into her coat and pulled out the water-damaged document she'd been carrying for months. Your Honor, I took this from Uncle Theodore's desk the night we left. I think you should see it. Judge Crawford examined the paper carefully, her expression growing darker with each line she read. Mills moved to look over her shoulder, and Clem saw both of their faces change as they understood what they were seeing. Mr. Ashford, Judge Crawford said slowly, this appears to be a petition to have the children declared legally missing, with provisions for transferring guardianship permanently to yourself. Were you planning to file this document? Theodore's composure slipped for the first time. That was merely a precautionary measure, in case the children couldn't be found. I had to protect their interests by having them declared dead, Mills asked sharply. Not dead, Theodore backpedaled. Missing. There's a significant legal difference. Annie stepped forward, her young voice cutting through the adults' arguments like a blade. Uncle Theodore, tell them about the night Mama and Papa died. The room went silent. Theodore's face went pale, and Clem felt every instinct honed by years of combat, telling him that something crucial was about to be revealed. What about that night, Annie? Judge Crawford asked gently. Annie's hand tightened on Clem's, but her voice remained steady. They didn't die in an accident. I saw what really happened. Theodore lunged forward as if to stop her from speaking, but the federal marshals moved to block him. You were just a child, he said desperately. You couldn't possibly remember clearly. I remember everything, Annie said, her eyes never leaving the judge's face. Papa and Mama were supposed to take the evening train to Colorado Springs for a business meeting. But at the last minute, Papa got a telegram saying the meeting was cancelled. They decided to stay home. Judge Crawford leaned forward, completely focused on Annie's words. But Uncle Theodore didn't know the plans had changed. Annie continued. He came to the house that night, and I heard him talking to Mama and Papa in the study. He was angry about something, about Papa's will, about the schools and hospitals Papa was building. He said Papa was throwing away the family fortune on people who didn't deserve it. Theodore's face had gone from pale to ashen. Annie, you're confused. Your imagination is... I'm not confused, Annie said with quiet certainty. You argued with Papa. You said if he wouldn't think about the family's future, you'd have to do it for him. And then her voice broke slightly, but she pressed on. Then there was a sound like something heavy falling, and Mama screamed. I ran to look, and I saw you standing over Papa with the brass letter opener from his desk. There was blood, and Mama was trying to help Papa, but you hit her too. The silence in the room was deafening. Theodore stood frozen, his face a mask of trapped desperation. You made it look like they'd died in the train accident, Annie whispered. You put their bodies on the train and derailed it in the canyon. But I saw what really happened. I saw you murder my parents. Judge Crawford's voice was barely controlled when she spoke. Mr. Ashford, these are extremely serious accusations. Theodore seemed to realize that his world was collapsing around him. "She's just a child," he said wildly. "A traumatized, imaginative child who's been living in the wilderness with a stranger. You can't possibly believe—" "I believe her," Mills said quietly. "Because 3 months ago I was hired not by you, Mr. Ashford, but by the honest executor of the Ashford estate, a man who suspected you of embezzlement and worse. We've been investigating the circumstances of Jonathan and Elizabeth Ashford's deaths, and Annie's testimony confirms what we've suspected all along." Mills turned to address the entire room. "I'm not just a lawyer, ladies and gentlemen. I'm a private investigator, working with federal authorities to expose what we believe was a carefully planned double murder designed to give Theodore Ashford control of one of Colorado's largest fortunes." The revelation hit Clem like a physical blow. Mills wasn't working for Theodore. He was working against him. The children hadn't been running from rescue. They'd been running toward it without knowing it. Theodore must have realized that escape was impossible because his demeanor changed completely. The facade of concerned uncle fell away, replaced by cold calculation. "You have no proof," he said. "The word of a child against a respected businessman. And even if you could prove something, which you can't, those children still need a guardian. They can't live in the mountains forever with some war-damaged hermit." It was then that Clem stepped forward, his military bearing evident in every line of his body. "Actually," he said, reaching into his pack, "I think they can." He pulled out a set of papers that Mills had never seen before, documents he'd been carrying since his trip to town weeks earlier. "Adoption papers," Clem said simply. "Filed with the territorial court before we went into hiding. Legal and binding, with Annie, Ben, and Charlie's full consent. They're not just under my protection, they're my children. Legally and officially." The bombshell left everyone speechless except for Charlie, who broke the silence with a joyful shout. "We're really a family." And in that moment, as Theodore Ashford's schemes crumbled around him and the truth finally came to light, Clem realized that sometimes the most important battles are won not with weapons or strength, but with love, courage, and the simple determination to protect what matters most. The aftermath of Annie's revelation transformed the general store into something resembling a military command post. Judge Crawford immediately ordered Theodore Ashford placed under arrest, while Mills began coordinating with the federal marshals to gather additional evidence for what would clearly become a murder trial. But Clem could see that the legal victory, significant as it was, represented only the beginning of a much larger battle. Theodore might be in custody, but the forces he'd set in motion, corrupt lawyers, falsified documents, and a network of people who'd profited from his schemes, were still out there, and they wouldn't give up easily. "Mr. Hartridge," Judge Crawford said, approaching him with the adoption papers he'd presented. "These documents appear to be in order, but I have to ask, when exactly did you file these?" Clem met her gaze steadily. 6 weeks ago, Your Honor, after I realized the children were in danger and that they wanted to stay with me permanently. Everything was done legally and with their full consent." Mills looked up from the telegraph messages he was sending to Denver. "That was remarkably prescient of you. Most people in your situation would have waited to see how the legal issues resolve themselves." "Most people," Clem replied, "don't understand that sometimes you have to commit to protecting someone before you know if you'll be allowed to keep them safe." Annie moved to stand beside Clem, her hand finding his with the natural ease of months of trust and affection. "He's been our real father since the first night he brought us home. The papers just make it official." Judge Crawford studied the 3 children, their obvious comfort with Clem, their health and happiness despite months of living as fugitives, their remarkable poise in handling circumstances that would have broken many adults. "I can see that," she said thoughtfully. "But there are still legal complexities we need to address. The children's inheritance, their parents' foundation, the businesses Theodore was managing, all of that needs to be sorted out properly." It was Ben who asked the question that had been weighing on all their minds. "What happens to Uncle Theodore?" Mills answered with the careful precision of someone who'd spent years building legal cases. He'll be tried for the murder of your parents, fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. If convicted, and the evidence is quite strong, he'll spend the rest of his life in prison. Charlie, who'd been unusually quiet since Annie's testimony, looked up at Clem with troubled eyes. Will they make us testify at the trial? Will we have to see him again? The fear in the little boy's voice struck Clem like a physical blow. These children had already endured more trauma than anyone should have to bear, and the thought of forcing them to relive their parents' murder in open court seemed almost cruel. That's something we'll work out, Judge Crawford said gently. Annie's testimony today, given in front of witnesses including myself and these federal officers, may be sufficient for most legal purposes. We'll do everything possible to protect you children from further distress. Over the next several hours, the general store became the center of the most complex legal proceeding Pine Ridge had ever witnessed. Mills produced a briefcase full of documents that revealed the scope of Theodore's corruption, falsified railroad contracts, embezzled funds, bribes paid to officials who'd helped cover up the circumstances of the Ashford parents' deaths. Murphy, delighted to be part of such momentous events, provided coffee and sandwiches while serving as an unofficial witness to everything that transpired. The federal marshals took detailed statements from everyone involved, while Judge Crawford worked through the legal implications of transferring guardianship from a murderer to the man who'd actually been protecting the children. As afternoon turned to evening, Clem found himself in the strange position of planning a future he'd hardly dared to hope for. The adoption papers were valid, the children were safe, and Theodore was in custody. But the responsibilities that came with officially becoming father to 3 of Colorado's wealthiest children were daunting in ways he was only beginning to understand. "Pa," Annie said, settling beside him on Murphy's front porch as the adults continued their discussions inside. "Are you worried about the money?" It was a perceptive question, typical of Annie's ability to see straight to the heart of complex issues. "Some," Clem admitted. "I never expected to be responsible for managing a fortune. I'm not sure I'm the right person for that kind of responsibility." Annie was quiet for a moment, watching the sun set behind the mountains that had been their refuge for so many months. "Mama always said that money was just a tool," she said finally. "Oh, what mattered was having people you trusted to help you use it properly." Ben and Charlie joined them on the porch, drawn by the rare opportunity to sit peacefully without looking over their shoulders for pursuers. For the first time in months, they could simply be children talking with their father about the future. "What will happen to Papa's schools and hospitals?" Ben asked. "Uncle Theodore said he was going to sell them to mining companies. That won't happen now," Clem assured him. "One of the things we'll need to do is find good people to help run those programs the way your parents intended." Mills emerged from the store with Judge Crawford, both looking satisfied but tired. "Mr. Hartridge," Mills said, "we need to discuss some practical matters. The children's inheritance includes not just money, but active businesses, charitable foundations, and properties that require ongoing management." "I figured as much," Clem replied. "I also figure I'm going to need help from people who understand those things better than I do." Judge Crawford smiled, the first genuinely warm expression Clem had seen from her. "That's exactly the right attitude. In fact, Mr. Mills has a proposal that might interest you." Mills sat down on the porch steps, looking more relaxed than he had all day. "The legal firm I work with has been managing estates for families like the Ashfords for over 20 years. We'd be honored to continue serving as advisors, but this time working for you and the children directly, rather than through a corrupt guardian." "What would that mean exactly?" Clem asked. "It means you'd make the important decisions, where the children live, how they're educated, which charitable programs to support. We'd handle the legal and financial details, provide advice when you ask for it, and make sure everything is done according to your wishes and the children's best interests." Annie looked up at Clem with eyes that held both hope and trust. "It means we could go home to our mountain, couldn't it? We could live the way we want to live." "With some modifications," Judge Crawford interjected. The children will need proper schooling, regular medical care, and some connection to the business and charitable interests they'll inherit. But there's no legal requirement that they live in Denver or conform to anyone else's idea of how wealthy children should be raised. Charlie clapped his hands together with delight. We can stay in the mountains and still help people like Mama and Papa did. That evening, as the legal complexities were finalized and arrangements made for their return to Denver to complete the formal proceedings, Clem found himself writing in his journal by lamplight once again. But these entries were different. They were plans rather than observations, dreams rather than mere documentation. He wrote about expanding the mountain cabin to accommodate a growing family, about finding teachers who could provide the children with excellent education, while allowing them to maintain their connection to the wilderness that had shaped them. He sketched ideas for programs that would use the Ashford fortune to help other children who'd been forgotten by society, other families torn apart by greed and cruelty. Most importantly, he wrote about the future he could now envision, a future where love and money worked together instead of against each other, where Annie, Ben, and Charlie could honor their parents' legacy while building the kind of life that brought them joy and purpose. What are you writing about now? Annie asked, settling beside him with her own small journal, a gift from Murphy, who'd been touched by her courage and wanted to encourage her to record her own thoughts and memories. Tomorrow, Clem said simply, and all the tomorrows after that. Mills had prepared one final set of documents, telegraph messages to be sent to Denver in the morning, officially notifying the legitimate executors of the Ashford estate that the missing heirs had been found, that their corrupt guardian was in custody, and that they were safe with their legally appointed father. But as Clem looked at the three children who'd changed his life so completely, he realized that the most important messages couldn't be sent by telegraph. They had to be lived day by day in the choices they made and the love they shared. The battle for their family was won, but the adventure of building their future together was just beginning. The Denver courthouse was nothing like the informal proceedings in Murphy's general store. 3 weeks after Theodore's arrest in Pine Ridge, the formal legal proceedings had begun, and the building buzzed with reporters, lawyers, and curious citizens drawn by what newspapers were calling the railroad inheritance murder trial. Clem sat in the front row of the courtroom with Annie, Ben, and Charlie, all of them dressed in the finest clothes Mills had insisted they needed for such an important occasion. The children looked uncomfortable in their formal attire, and Clem felt equally out of place in his new suit. But Judge Crawford had explained that appearances mattered in proceedings of this magnitude. Theodore sat at the defendant's table with his expensive lawyers, looking every inch the respectable businessman he'd pretended to be. Only his eyes betrayed the desperation of a man whose carefully constructed lies were crumbling around him. The prosecutor, a stern woman named Margaret Walsh, rose to address the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about greed in its most vicious form, the murder of 2 innocent people by a man who was supposed to protect their children's interests. Annie's hand found Clem's as the prosecutor began outlining the evidence against Theodore. Despite her courage in Pine Ridge, the formal courtroom setting was intimidating, and Clem could feel her tension through their clasped fingers. The defendant, Theodore Ashford, systematically embezzled funds from his brother's railroad empire, Walsh continued. When Jonathan and Elizabeth Ashford discovered his theft and threatened to expose him, he murdered them both and attempted to make it appear accidental. Theodore's lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Harrison, objected frequently, trying to characterize the prosecution's case as speculation based on the unreliable testimony of a traumatized child. But Walsh had come prepared with more than just Annie's account. Mills had spent the week since Theodore's arrest gathering evidence, and the results were damning. Bank records showed systematic transfers of Ashford money into accounts controlled by Theodore. Railroad contracts had been altered to favor companies that paid him kickbacks. Most importantly, an examination of the train wreckage that supposedly killed the children's parents revealed evidence that the bodies had been placed on the train after death. When Annie was called to testify, she walked to the witness stand with the same quiet dignity she'd shown that first night behind Murphy's store. The court clerk, an elderly woman with kind eyes, administered the oath with special gentleness. "Annie," Prosecutor Walsh said softly, "can you tell the court about the night your parents died?" Annie's voice was clear and steady as she recounted the events of that terrible evening. She spoke without drama or embellishment, simply stating what she had seen and heard. The courtroom was absolutely silent as she described Theodore's argument with her father, the sounds of violence from the study, and her glimpse of Theodore standing over her parents' bodies. "Did you tell anyone what you had witnessed?" Walsh asked. "I tried to tell Uncle Theodore the next day," Annie replied. "I thought maybe he could help find who hurt Mama and Papa, but when I started to describe what I'd seen, he got very angry and told me I was imagining things. He said if I kept telling lies about grown-ups, I might have to go away to a special school where they taught children not to make up stories." Theodore's lawyer attempted to discredit Annie's testimony during cross-examination, suggesting that grief and trauma had confused her memories. But Annie remained unshakable, answering each question with the same calm certainty. "Isn't it possible," Harrison pressed, "that you saw something innocent and your imagination filled in the frightening details?" Annie looked directly at Theodore for the first time since entering the courtroom. "I know what I saw," she said simply. "Uncle Theodore killed my parents because they found out he was stealing from us." The most dramatic moment came when Mills testified about Theodore's attempt to have the children declared permanently missing. He produced the document Annie had taken from Theodore's desk, along with additional papers found during a search of Theodore's Denver office. The defendant had already prepared legal paperwork to assume permanent control of the Ashford estate, Mills explained to the jury. If the children had remained missing for just a few more months, he would have gained access to their entire inheritance. When Theodore himself took the stand in his own defense, his testimony was a masterpiece of misdirection and self-justification. He portrayed himself as a devoted uncle, trying to protect his brother's children from their own naivety about money and responsibility. "Jonathan was a dreamer," Theodore said, his voice heavy with practiced sorrow. "He wanted to give away the family fortune to every charitable cause that appealed to his emotions. Someone had to think practically about the children's future." But under cross-examination, Theodore's composure began to crack. Walsh systematically dismantled his explanations for the embezzled funds, the falsified contracts, and most damaging of all, his presence at his brother's house on the night of the murders when he claimed to have been elsewhere. "Mr. Ashford," Walsh said, her voice cutting through Theodore's evasions, "you've claimed you were at your club that evening, but we have witnesses who place you at your brother's house at the exact time these murders occurred." Theodore's face flushed red. "Those witnesses are mistaken. A child's confused memories and the word of mountain folk against a respected businessman. Are you saying Annie is lying about what she saw?" The question hung in the air like a sword. Theodore looked toward the children's table, seeing Annie's steady gaze fixed on him with unwavering certainty. "She's confused," he said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. That's when the courtroom Bible was brought forward for Theodore's re-sworn testimony, the moment when truth would finally, definitively triumph over lies. The moment Theodore's hand touched the courthouse Bible for his re-sworn testimony, something shifted in the courtroom atmosphere. Judge Crawford's stern voice filled the space as she administered the oath with particular emphasis on the consequences of perjury. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God?" Theodore's "I do" was barely audible, and Clem noticed sweat beading on the man's forehead. Despite the cool autumn air in the courtroom, Prosecutor Walsh approached the witness stand with a document Clem hadn't seen before. Something Mills had passed to her during a brief recess. Mr. Ashford, Walsh said. I want to show you a telegram dated the day before your brother's death. It's addressed to you from the Denver First National Bank. Theodore's face went ashen as Walsh read the telegram aloud. Final notice. Loan default proceedings will begin Monday unless full payment of $200,000 received by close of business Friday. Were you in debt to Denver First National Bank? Theodore's lawyer objected, but Judge Crawford overruled him. The financial motive for murder was clearly relevant to the case. I had some temporary cash flow issues, Theodore admitted reluctantly. $200,000 worth of temporary issues, Walsh pressed. And this telegram was received the day before you murdered your brother and sister-in-law. I did not murder anyone. Then explain this. Walsh produced another document, a bank deposit slip dated 3 days after the supposed train accident, showing a deposit of exactly $200,000 into Theodore's personal account. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as the jury absorbed the implications. Theodore had paid off his massive debt within days of his brother's death, using money that could only have come from the Ashford estate. But it was Mills who delivered the final, devastating blow. He approached the bench with a leather portfolio and requested permission to present new evidence discovered just that morning. Your Honor, Mills said, we've located the murder weapons. The courtroom fell silent as Mills opened the portfolio to reveal the brass letter opener Annie had described, along with a detailed forensic report. This letter opener was found hidden in the defendant's Denver office behind a false panel in his desk. Laboratory analysis confirms the presence of blood that matches samples taken from Jonathan Ashford's exhumed remains. Theodore's lawyer was on his feet, objecting frantically, but the damage was done. Physical evidence now corroborated every detail of Annie's testimony. Judge Crawford called for order as Theodore seemed to realize that his carefully constructed lies were finally, irrevocably exposed. His face cycled through emotions, denial, rage, and finally, desperate calculation, Your Honor, Theodore said suddenly, standing up despite his lawyer's frantic gestures to remain seated. I want to change my plea. The courtroom exploded in chaos. Judge Crawford banged her gavel repeatedly, calling for order, while Theodore's lawyers tried unsuccessfully to stop their client from speaking. I want to make a deal, Theodore continued, his voice rising above the commotion. I have information about other irregularities in Colorado Railroad contracts, bribes paid to territorial officials. I can provide evidence of corruption that goes far beyond this case. Prosecutor Walsh's voice cut through the noise like a blade. Are you confessing to the murders of Jonathan and Elizabeth Ashford? Theodore looked around the courtroom, at the jury's horrified faces, at Judge Crawford's stern disapproval, at the reporters scribbling frantically in their notebooks. Finally, his gaze settled on Annie, Ben, and Charlie sitting together in the front row. They were going to ruin everything, he said, his voice breaking. Jonathan was going to expose the loans, the contracts, all of it. 20 years of building the railroad empire, and he was going to throw it away on schools for minors' children and hospitals for people who couldn't pay. Annie stood up, her young voice somehow carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. You killed them for money. Theodore's composure cracked completely. You don't understand. That money was family money. It belonged to all of us, not just your father's bleeding heart causes. It belonged to people who needed help, Annie replied with quiet dignity. That's what Mama and Papa believed, and that's what we believe too. Judge Crawford's gavel came down with finality. Mr. Ashford, you are confessing to the murders of Jonathan and Elizabeth Ashford? Theodore slumped in his chair, the weight of his confession and the certain knowledge of his fate finally breaking his spirit. Yes, he whispered. I killed them both. The courtroom erupted again, but this time it was with relief and vindication rather than shock. Justice was finally being served, and the truth that Annie had carried for so many months was finally, officially recognized. Mills approached the children's table with a manila envelope, his face showing a mixture of professional satisfaction and personal joy. I have something for you, he told Clem quietly. opening the envelope to reveal a set of official documents with impressive seals and ribbons. They were adoption papers, not the territorial documents Clem had filed months earlier, but federal papers that would be recognized in any state or territory. Papers that made Annie, Ben, and Charlie officially and permanently his children, with all legal protections that status provided. "Welcome to your new family, legally and forever," Mills said, shaking Clem's hand with genuine warmth. As Theodore was led away in shackles and the courtroom began to empty, Clem looked at the three children who had changed his life so completely. They were no longer refugees or missing heirs or pawns in someone else's game. They were simply his children, free to build whatever future they chose together. 6 months after Theodore Ashford's conviction and sentencing to life in prison, the mountain cabin that had once sheltered 4 desperate souls had transformed into something none of them could have imagined during those first uncertain days. The original structure remained, but careful additions had expanded it into a proper home, one that honored both the simple mountain life they'd chosen and the responsibilities that came with the Ashford legacy. Clem stood on the expanded front porch, watching Annie help Charlie with his mathematics, while Ben practiced the violin that had arrived with their latest shipment of supplies from Denver. The morning sun painted the peaks around them in shades of gold and rose, and the crisp October air carried the promise of winter's approach. "Pai," Annie called, looking up from Charlie's arithmetic book. "Mr. Mills is coming up the trail." Clem shielded his eyes against the morning light and spotted the familiar figure of their lawyer and friend making his monthly journey up the mountain. Mills had kept his promise to serve as their advisor and connection to the business world. But more importantly, he'd become part of their extended family. "Morning." "Clem," Mills called as he approached the cabin, leading a pack horse loaded with mail, supplies, and the inevitable stack of documents requiring attention. "Beautiful day for a ride up the mountain." "Every day's beautiful up here," Clem replied, helping Mills unload the pack horse. "Coffee's fresh if you want some." As they settled around the large table that had replaced Clem's original small one, Mills spread out the latest reports from the Ashford businesses and charitable foundations. The numbers were impressive. Under honest management, the railroad empire was more profitable than ever, while the schools and hospitals Jonathan and Elizabeth had envisioned were flourishing throughout Colorado. "The Children's Education Fund is performing exceptionally well," Mills reported, showing Annie a ledger filled with neat columns of figures. "We'll be able to establish 3 new schools this year, plus expand the medical clinic in Silver Creek." Annie studied the numbers with the serious attention she brought to all matters involving her parents' legacy. At 11, she already understood more about business and charitable management than most adults ever would. "What about the scholarship program for minors' children?" she asked. "Fully funded for the next 5 years, Mills smiled. "Your father would be proud of how you're carrying on his work." Ben looked up from tuning his violin. "Are we still planning to visit the new school in Durango next month?" "If the weather holds," Clem replied, "though we might have to take the long way around if the early snows block the high passes." These monthly trips to visit the various Ashford projects had become an important part of their routine. The children needed to understand the impact of their parents' vision, while the communities benefiting from Ashford generosity needed to see that the family's commitment remained strong. Charlie, now 7 and reading at a level that amazed everyone, held up a letter from the stack Mills had brought. "This one's from Murphy. He says the general store is doing real well, and he's thinking about expanding." "That's wonderful news," Clem said, taking the letter and noting Murphy's careful handwriting. Their old friend had become something of a local celebrity after his role in exposing Theodore's crimes, and business in Pine Ridge had grown accordingly. Mills pulled out a leather portfolio and set it on the table with particular care. "I have something special today," he said, opening it to reveal a large photograph in an elegant frame. The photograph showed the 4 of them standing in front of their expanded cabin, but it wasn't just any family portrait. This one had been taken by a professional photographer from Denver, commissioned specifically to replace the torn and damaged picture Annie had carried through all their months of uncertainty. "It's perfect," Annie breathed, studying the image that captured not just their faces, but the love and contentment that had grown between them. In the photograph, Clem stood behind his 3 children, his weathered hands resting gently on their shoulders. Annie sat straight and proud, her eyes bright with intelligence and determination. Ben smiled with the quiet joy that had replaced his earlier fearfulness. Charlie grinned with the unguarded happiness of a child who had never known a day of insecurity since coming to live on the mountain. "We look like a real family," Charlie announced, stating what everyone was thinking. "We are a real family," Clem corrected gently. "We always have been since that first night I found you behind Murphy's store." Mills stayed for lunch, sharing news from Denver and discussing plans for a new wing at a children's hospital that would be dedicated to caring for orphaned children, a project Annie had specifically requested in honor of other children who'd lost their parents. As afternoon faded toward evening and Mills prepared for his journey back to town, Clem found himself reflecting on the strange turns life could take. A year ago, he'd been a lonely hermit, convinced that his purpose in the world had ended with the war. Now he was father to 3 remarkable children and steward of a fortune dedicated to making the world a better place. "Pa," Annie said, as they watched Mills disappear down the mountain trail, "do you ever miss the quiet?" Clem looked around at the scene of comfortable chaos that had become his life. Ben's music sheets scattered across the table, Charlie's adventure books stacked by his chair, Annie's careful notes about charitable projects covering every available surface. "Not for a minute," he said honestly. The quiet was just emptiness waiting to be filled with something better. That evening, as they gathered around the fireplace for their nightly reading time, Clem hung the new family photograph in the place of honor above the mantel. The torn picture that had brought them together was carefully preserved in Annie's memory box. But this new image represented everything they'd built together. As he looked at the faces of his children in the firelight, faces that had taught him that love could heal any wound, and that family was defined not by blood or law, but by the simple choice to care for one another. Clem understood that some treasures truly couldn't be measured in dollars. The greatest fortune he'd ever inherited was sitting right there beside him, reading stories and planning tomorrow's adventures, secure in the knowledge that they would face whatever came next together.